The seventh thing that got cut from Halo 2 was an enemy called the Shield Carrier Flood form. And, well, like the name suggested, it was actually just a Flood Carrier form, but this time around with a Jackal energy shield attached to them in the front. And these enemies actually made it pretty far in development and were fully designed. They are basically found in modders in the Halo 2 files and actually can be spawned throughout the game using modding tools. And if you actually kill this Flood, it would actually drop the Jackal shield, which the player then could have used, and well, once again, we'll later elaborate on this cut weapon later on, but it was actually a usable weapon in game. Later on though, as we all know, Bungie seemed to cut these enemies as once again they just probably didn't have enough time to fully fix the issues with them, but also in my personal opinion just being a simply horrible idea to give the Flood Jackal energy swords. I mean, the Flood carrier forms and in general the Flood were already a pain in the ass, but just then giving them an energy sword in the front basically just makes them so much more harder. I mean, I can't even imagine how difficult this enemy would have been on the Halo 2 Legendary, which is already difficult enough. Overall, I'm just kind of glad that this enemy never made it to its final release. It's honestly a pretty absurd idea, and I'm glad it got cut. The eighth thing that was cut from Halo 2 was actually this thing called a special purpose sniper that we actually can see in the behind the scenes docs for Halo 2 with some various concept art done for it. A variety of designs were considered for this enemy, some having one leg, some having two. It also seemed that this enemy would have been more of an advanced class above those dreaded damn Jackal snipers from Halo 2. God, I hate those things. Now, a lot of work was actually done on this enemy, as seen in this behind the scenes doc. Tons of concept art was done for it, and a possible even build of this enemy was put into the game, but it seemed like it was cut early on by Bungie, probably for a better idea to work on for another enemy. Overall, I think that this idea of a new sniper for Halo 2 is honestly pretty interesting. I think that some of the designs look like really cool, interesting cut snipers from Halo CE and also just more other sci-fi franchises. I think it would have been an interesting enemy, but just needed more further development. The ninth thing that was cut from Halo 2 was actually the Sentinel variants, which were actually planned for the game. This included one that would have basically shot out pulse beams, the same type that the bigger shield Sentinels would have shot out as well. Other Sentinel variants that were considered included ones that would have shot out charge bolts and also used a grenade launcher and also used needlers as well, which basically hinted at even possibly more variants that were also cut for the game as well that we just haven't discovered. Now, just for a disclaimer, this is not to be confused with the needler Sentinels that actually did make it to the final game of Halo 2, but were just a glitch, when basically a designer made a mistake of switching the weapons on one of the Sentinels in the final shipped product. Just a kind of weird side fact. Overall, I think that the concept of Sentinel variants would have been really cool and added some much needed variety to the Sentinel class in Halo 2. Once again, kind of a shame that we never got to see it, but still an interesting concept. So that was most of the notable NPCs and enemies that were cut from Halo 2 I wanted to cover. Some of it was honestly a true shame that was cut, and some of them I'm just glad never made it to the final game. And some are just whatever, to be honest. Still though, it's a fascinating deep dive into a lot of the notable enemies and NPCs that were cut from Halo 2. Now for this section of the video where basically we're going to cover all of the lost Halo 2 power-ups, abilities, and gameplay elements that we never got to see in the final game. Just the true scale and amount of cut content here is truly insane, many of it that I didn't even know. Regardless though, let's get into the lost and cut power-up abilities, gameplay elements, and other things that we never got to see in the gameplay of Halo 2. Let's get into it. One of the most famous gameplay mechanics that was cut from Halo 2 was actually sprint, as this game was originally supposed to have it, believe it or not. It actually had a lot of finished work put into it, with even modders finding it in the Halo 2 files and reviving it, with even many weapons also having sprinting animations as well alongside your Spartan as well. Even with this hilarious animation of the player throwing up middle fingers as a fun part of it. Not quite sure if this would have made it to the final game, but just, oh my god, just hilarious. Sprint in Halo 2 would have acted pretty similar to other games like Halo 4. It would have been an ability that the player would have had and been able to use. Basically, if you used it for too long, the player would have ran out of breath and you would have had to recharge. So ultimately, despite a lot of work being put into this ability for Halo 2, why was it cut from the final game? Well, for multiple reasons. The art director of Bungie during the game's development said it was cut mainly just due to pacing issues, and also it was basically used in some of the early prototyping stages for Halo 2, but once again was cut. Another reason why it was cut was mainly due to the fact that Bungie just didn't have enough resources and just enough memory and space to basically finish it, as basically it was cut in the frantic rush to complete the game. It was either sprint or dual wielding that could be added to the game, and Bungie decided to choose the latter to add add to the final game. Overall, it's just kind of crazy to think that Sprint could have been an OG Halo game. It would have been really fascinating to see how that would have all played out, especially if it was introduced earlier in the series. And who knows, maybe it would have been not so controversial later on when 343 decided to bring it into the series in Halo 4. I think that Sprint would have been a nice element to the gameplay, but I just in general would have to see more of it in action just to see how it would have mixed with those classic Halo 2 elements. Overall though, I think that Sprint is a really cool element of Halo 2 that we never got to see. Another cut system that was once again kind of already previously mentioned was actually the entire cut gameplay mechanic of stealth with Halo 2. It would have showcased in the original level Delta Temple like mentioned before. Eventually though, that level got turned into the missions Delta and Regret in the final game. Tons of features were included in this cut stealth system, including an alert system where you're basically killing enemies would have some consequences if the bodies were actually discovered. Also dynamic lighting, sensible shadows were also meant to enhance the overall system and make it work. Also tons of features and enemies are also meant to be included in this game mechanic as well, like the Calm Grunt or Stealth Elites. Also, other cut abilities like Infravision, which were eventually used in Halo 3 ODST, were also supposed to be implemented in this Lost Stealth system. Now, despite some significant progress being made into the stealth system, Bungie decided to cut this mechanic midway in development, as it was realized the engine that was going to be used with the advanced dynamic lighting and sensible effects could not be put into the final game, as there was no hardware on the Xbox that could properly run it, not alone on Bungie's hardware as well. So that's why the reason that the cut stealth system was ultimately never made it to the final game. Honestly, overall, I would have loved to see the stealth system put into Halo 2. It would have added a lot of variety and a lot of interesting elements to the previous gameplay of Halo 2. Kind of a shame we never got to see this system play out. Another cut system from Halo 2 that just never made it to the final board was actually the whole power-up system. Yet, believe it or not, there was actually supposed to be a power-ups mechanic in Halo 2. It was actually mostly prototyped in the engine as well and made significant progress, even existing in paper design documentation penned by multiplayer lead Max Hoberman. It was a whole planned out power-up system that was going to be used in Halo 2's multiplayer, giving it more depth to the overall gameplay. So what were the actual power-ups that would have been used in this lost mechanic? Well, the first one was actually the cut power-up Adrenaline, already mentioned in the design documents in the cut multiplayer map Cyclone. My assumption would have been that this would have given the player basically faster speed and abilities, basically including reloading and also getting into vehicles as well, but it looks like early on it was cut. The second power-up in this system that was cut was actually called Haste, which according to multiplayer lead Max Hoberman, he described it as, there will be a new power-up called Haste. This will increase your movement speed by 250%. When you move at full speed, you have motion blur. So it will basically act as a speed boost in the game. This power-up was also later implemented in Halo 4's multiplayer, though eventually in the final game, so luckily we have traces of it in Halo still. The third power-up cut was actually Infravision, which according to the design documents from Halo 2, when you use this power-up, you'll be able to pick out opponents better in dark environments and far away. You will also be able to see invisible players. If an explosion goes off while using this power-up, you'll be temporarily blinded. It acted pretty similar to the Viscer mode from Halo 3 ODST, and sadly though this power-up just never made it to the final cut. It was only in paper for the most part. It was cut mainly due to the fact that there was a lack of dynamic lighting in the final game, and also the other stencil effects that were just not making it to the final cut due to the development issues ongoing in Halo 2. The final power-up that at least we know about that was cut from Halo 2 was actually Quad Damage. It was actually mentioned in a 2003 multiplayer document on a cut game mode called the Lightbringer, and basically like the name suggests, it would basically just dealt increased damage to players. And it also would have allowed for faster health regeneration as well when you had this power-up. Sadly though, this thing was also cut from the final game, alongside the game mode and just entire system in general. It was eventually brought back though as damage boost in Halo 4's multiplayer, so at least that's something. And overall, that was the lost power-up system for Halo 2. I honestly would have loved to see this put into the multiplayer, as it would have added a lot more depth and more interesting elements to the overall game, but sadly it just never made it to the cut. Still, it would have been fascinating if Halo had this stuff. Other cut items and gameplay mechanics in the final game that I wanted to mention first include the idea of ammo pickups, which basically was a cut element in the game that would have allowed players to pick up ammo on the battlefield, and not just constantly pick up new weapons in the game as well once you run out of ammo. And now, even though this mechanic never made it to the final game, this idea is sort of in the final game, as in Halo you can basically pick up the same weapon type and basically replenish his ammo that way. Still though, overall the idea of an ammo drop-off sort of thing like Call of Duty was pretty interesting. Another item that was cut from Halo 2 was actually the idea of health packs, which are a prominent part of the Halo Combat Evolved multiplayer and campaign. The Halo 2 health pack pretty much would have acted pretty similar to the one in Halo Combat Evolved, but this time around it would have had a slight sort of cosmetic difference to it. It would also appeared in some earlier builds of the Halo 2 multiplayer, like in some early 2003 maps and some Milestone 1 maps as well. How this health pack was actually discovered was pretty interesting, as basically it was discovered in the shared map files for Halo 2, complete with the finished model and textures and code as well. And like mentioned, it acts pretty similar to Halo 1's health pack, but just with some slight differences, like not having the red stripe like the original. It also has this weird animation where it would have flashed the stream and basically gave health to your character. And it would have featured this weird animation where it basically would have flashed the entire screen and gave health to your character. Eventually though, as Halo 2's development progressed, the idea of Bungie for the health pack became less and less popular, as the idea of health just really didn't matter as much in the final game, until finally the health pack was cut out entirely from Halo 2's multiplayer, and eventually replaced with the idea that health can regenerate their shields on its own now. I think overall the idea of Halo 2, especially as hard that game can be at times, having a health pack is honestly a really fascinating and could have helped out a lot in those moments of the game. I think the idea of basically collecting your health allows you to basically act more cautiously and also act with more skill as you play through your game, and honestly I think that Halo 2 needed some kind of health pack system. Later on though, as we all know, health packs were eventually brought in with Halo 3 ODST and eventually Halo Reach, which honestly was a good improvement. Overall though, that was all of the major cut power-ups and gameplay mechanics and other elements cut for Halo 2 I wanted to mention. Now with that section of the video finally being done, we got even more cut content to discuss for Halo 2. Yes, there's even more cut content. This time around, let's get into the Halo 2 Lost cut game modes that were essentially supposed to be in the final multiplayer of the game. Most of these modes were in various stages of development, but were cut ultimately. Regardless though, let's get into it. The first game mode that we will discuss is actually a mode called Headhunter, which was actually a game mode cut from the final game. The basic premise of this mode is that players would go around, collect skulls, and drop them in a safe zone. Whoever had the most skulls would essentially win the game mode. Now, for actual progress on this mode, it was actually found to be mostly functional, with it pretty much being complete, besides some issues with bottleneck of users and the UA design. Modders actually found a playable build of this game mode from the Halo 2 Alpha multiplayer build from way back in the day. Sadly though, Bungie cut this game mode. Most likely the reason was the fact that they were not able to fix the issues with the bottleneck and the UA design in time before the game had to be shipped off to production. Overall, I think that the mode has a really cool idea and honestly looks fun to play. We did eventually get it in Halo Reach, which is honestly pretty cool, but still it would have been awesome if Halo 2 had it from the beginning. Juggernaut was actually a game mode that was shipped in the final build of Halo 2. The basic premise is that being that one player has extreme health and strength and basically is just being hunted down by other players, similar to other games like Call of Duty. But did you know that a version of this game mode was actually lost and scrapped that would have actually included the Flood Juggernaut being the strong player that the players have been able to actually try to kill. Players would also have been able to control the Flood form, which was intended to be, quote, sturdier, heavier, and actually do more damage and jump twice as high. Players would have been able to use its tentacles to attack other players with the triggers on the Xbox controllers as the buttons. This version of the mode was sadly scrapped as the enemy in question in general for Halo 2 was also cut, resulting in this game mode also being scrapped as well. And also another reason why the game mode most likely got cut was mainly due to the fact that the development time and the manpower to fully implement this game mode also just wasn't there, so they had to cut corners and basically ship out the tamed down version in the final build. Overall, it's a true shame that we never got to see the original Flood Juggernaut form in all its original glory. Still though, it's pretty great that we got the original game mode. Race was a cut game mode from Halo 2 that, like the name suggested, was basically a race to reach all the checkpoints on the map against other players also in the race. Whoever does this first basically wins the game mode. This mode was actually in the original Halo CE, and for a long time it was considered for Halo 2, even in the mode selection screen in the Halo 2 Alpha with the description of complete the required number of laps before your opponents, blowing away the competition. So it seemed that a lot of work was actually put into developing this game mode, with even an early concept of burial mounds including the race mode as well. But sadly though, this whole mode got cut and scrapped. I'm sure it was one of the many things that the team just simply did not have enough time in the rush to complete the game to fully develop. It's a shame, as this mode would have been sick to have in Halo 2. Warfare is kind of a whole nother topic entirely, but this was basically a massive cut game mode from Halo 2 with a lot of great ambition behind it. The mode consisted of a massive scale Spartan versus Elite asymmetric battle with up to 32 players involved in this game mode at some point. And even Even back in the day, this was a huge feat and ambitious for the time for Bungie to even attempt. And honestly, the story behind this game mode and legacy behind it is really fascinating, so let's get into it. Back in Halo Combat Evolved's development, plans for a large-scale multiplayer game mode featuring Marines versus Elites in a round-based setting were basically being developed. Players would have to attack, defend, and control certain points in the map basically to win, with players having the ability to choose different locations to spawn and attack enemies, similar to modes like Battlefield. This mode was worked on a bit with some light prototyping done with Bungie while they were working on the game while in Chicago for Halo Combat Evolved. But after Bungie was bought by Microsoft in 2000, in the scramble to finish the game, the mode was abandoned as simply just not enough resources were put in place for it to be fully developed. But larger scale maps like Blood Gulch did have hints of a larger scale multiplayer that those maps were originally intended for, and hinted at that Lost Warfare mode that we've been discussing. Now, when it came time for the development of Halo 2, the multiplayer team wanted to bring this idea back for the multiplayer. A design doc was created by designer Janie Greener with top-down designs for the mode for what it was intended for. The version in Halo 2 that they were working on was similar to Big Team Battle but larger in scale, with a max of 32 players proposed, whether or not at the time that was possible on a network level. Spartans versus Elites across a big map where players would have to control certain points and also do certain objectives as well. Vehicle combat was also planned for this mode due to the sheer size of the whole thing, even with players having the ability to apparently call in airstrikes on your opponents like Call of Duty being planned as well. Jamie presented this planned warfare mode to Jason Jones at the studio, but other people on the multiplayer team like Max Homerman basically wanted to have the multiplayer go away from this big online warfare style of mode and basically move the multiplayer into more of a LAN style of play essentially, as most of the people at the time did not have a stable broadband internet connection to support the size of such a mode. Eventually though, as the Halo 2's multiplayer development progressed, eventually Hoberman would win out and get his idea ultimately greenlit. Still though, at the time, both ideas were seemingly greenlit, as Jamie and other designers continued to work on the warfare mode on a separate sect of the multiplayer team, while at the same time Hoberman and his team were working on a smaller scale multiplayer focusing on 2v2 or 4v4 style of play, with large scale arena multiplayer and party style couch system mechanics being implemented later on. Later on in the development of 2003, as the game started to progress in its development, a design document from Jamie showed that there was actually little active development being actually implemented for warfare. Despite this though, some documents still showed that there was some hope for the game mode to make it to retail, and it was still being considered for Bungie at the time to make it to the game. Eventually though, Jason Jones had Hoberman lead Halo 2's multiplayer team entirely, and incorporated the warfare and arena teams together to basically get the multiplayer out before the deadline to ship the game. And seemingly in the scramble to develop the game in 2003 to 2004, it seemingly this was the official death nail for the game mode, officially canceling the mode at the studio officially. Eventually though, the idea of warfare in Halo 2 didn't eventually all die out, as life signs for the mode still continued and trugged along in Halo 2's development, as later on in Halo 2's alpha, warfare is actually listed in the multiplayer selection screen, which I'm assuming Bungie was still holding out hope that they can actually get the mode finished in time for the game's release. But as we all know, it never made it to the final game. It was mainly cancelled mainly due to the fact that they just simply did not have enough time in Halo 2's brutal development to basically finish it. And also all of the networking and supporting issues that would have been done to make it work, it just was impossible to get it out in time. And sadly though, that was the end of warfare. But the legacy of this game mode, even though it never made it to Halo 2, did live on in the Halo universe. In Halo 3, warfare was once again considered, but it was scrapped early on. Later on, this mode really just couldn't catch a break. In Halo Reach, a mode called Invasion, which was basically a big 6v6 mode, which was similar to Warzone, did ship, but once again, it wasn't on scale like the original warfare mode that was considered back in the day for Halo 2. And finally, in some good news, in 2015, in the game Halo 5 Guardians, yes, that game, a mode called Warzone was shipped. That was essentially the same thing with vehicles and also a huge amount of players, and essentially was the same thing as the original concept of warfare from back in the day with Halo 2. So at least it lived on in that way. Overall, I think that the mode Warzone was super ambitious for Halo 2, and honestly if it was fully realized and Bungie had the time to develop it, it honestly would have been amazing. But at the same time, back in 2004, I'm not really quite sure if such an ambitious mode with a 32 player max would have been even possible. I mean, it might have been possible, but just would have been extremely difficult. Still though, this mode was super cool, and I'm glad that this concept lived on later on in other games and eventually making it to Halo 5. Now that we actually have covered the mostly finished game modes, or at least the modes that have a lot of information about them, now we get to talk about the prototype modes. Modes that are essentially started on but were never actually finished. The reason why we actually know about these is actually in the code for Halo 2, there was a fork in the code called MP_partygame 2's_prototype. That was basically split off by modders that showed off the mini game modes that Bungie was working on, but never got to the actual completion stage. Regardless though, let's get into these lost game modes. The first of these prototype game modes was actually Infection, which was originally supposed to be in Halo 2, believe it or not. The mode, as we all know, the premise is essentially an affected player basically infects other players till basically one side consumes all the other. The actual development on this mode actually was mostly far along, with the team changing aspect of the mode still being there, and the mode also did make it to a prototyping stage, but ultimately at the end of the day never made it to the final cut and got scrapped. Most likely due to the resources and the time constraints thanks to Halo 2's brutal development. Now luckily though, as we all know, Infection will eventually show up in Halo 3 and become a huge staple of the games ever since, and honestly it's one of my favorite modes in general. The mode was also eventually recovered and at least discovered after 343 recovered the fork in 2018 containing the lost prototype game modes, and the modes were eventually added to the Halo 2 editing kit and eventually were released in 2014 by the Dig Site team. Overall, Infection is one of the best game modes in the Halo series, and the fact that we almost got it in Halo 2 is truly insane, and it's honestly a shame we never got to see it, but still overall I'm glad it appeared in the series. The second cut prototype mode that made it to Halo 2 but was cut was the mode called Medic, a mysterious Halo 2 game mode recovered by the Dig Site team. The basic premise of the mode would be that a player would spawn in a bounding zone surrounding them, and basically hinting the name most likely would involve healing other players in order to win the game mode. Sadly though, that looks like that's all the information we've been able to gather about this game mode, and as we all know it got cut. I'm assuming just because Bungie didn't have enough time to properly make it work in the game. Overall though, it does sound like a pretty interesting game mode. The third cut mode that never made it to Halo 2 was actually the mode called VIP, which was later implemented in one of the released incomplete modes for Halo 3 by the Dig Site team. So it's overall pretty interesting that this little incomplete mode still in a way was originally supposed to be in Halo 2. The next section of the game modes part is I want to actually talk about the modes that never really had any serious development done on them, really just most of them being on paper. The first of these was a mode called Assassin. Its premise was essentially that the game would choose a player as a target, and it was basically the other player's job to basically take him out. The mode was written by Max Homerman and some design documentation, but ultimately it never really got past the planning stage and development. Most likely got cut just due to the fact that Bungie decided to put resources into other game modes that they felt would work better for Halo 2. The next mode that got cut was the already mentioned Lightbringer mode, where basically the player has quad damage and has to survive with it to the end of the mode. Design documents for this mode were created by the multiplayer lead Max Hoberman, but was cut, only making it to the planning stages. Most likely just wasn't the fact that there was a lack of resources, but also just other factors that probably contributed to its cancellation. Overall, that was most of the notable game modes that were cut from Halo 2. A lot of them that were super cool and interesting, like of course Infection, Warzone, and others that sound interesting and could have been amazing, but we just simply never got to see them realized. Overall, a pretty interesting part of lost media for Halo 2. Now for the cut vehicles for Halo 2, and my god, there's quite a lot of them. Some of them actually may even shock you, to be frankly honest with you, the fact that they were originally supposed to be in Halo 2. Regardless though, let's get into the human side of things, the UNSC cut vehicles. Let's get into it. The first vehicle cut that we have on this list is actually the Falcon, which surprisingly enough was originally supposed to be in Halo 2, a fact that even surprised me, to be frankly honest with you. The origin of the Falcon started out as basically the need for a Black Hawk type of vehicle in the Halo universe that would essentially transport troops as needed in combat situations. It kind of would act as a smaller cousin to the Pelican in a way. The design of the Halo 2 Falcon basically bore a resemblance to a strike fighter and was basically piloted by one person instead of two. It would also feature an open space to carry passengers throughout the battlefield and also pick up supplies as needed. Now for the actual development of the Falcon, it actually made it pretty far. The Falcon was actually prototyped in 3D shortly after the release of Halo Combat Evolved, showing Bungie's excitement about the concept and vehicle. And eventually the Falcon was made into a ploy blockout model that players could get into and fly using some modding tools in Halo 2. The Falcon even appeared in some early beta builds of Halo 2, and was eventually recovered fully with the Blackout's rough state, so to speak, in the map files for Halo 2 and the Master Chief Collection. Sadly though, even though this vehicle actually made it to some kind of blockout model, eventually though the early progress on this vehicle was cut from Halo 2 early on. It seemed like the reason behind its cancellation was mainly due to the fact there was just a lot of time constraints and they did not have enough time to finish the vehicle, and also just to get it working properly in the engine, which it was probably most likely one of the reasons why it was cut. Luckily though, the legacy of this vehicle is still being felt, and obviously the fact that we've been able to get it restored in game is still a huge feat, mainly thanks to modders in Halo, it was found in MCC in the files and was actually able to be used by players, like I said before, using modding tools. And even people like Ventral Vadem were able to restore it fully with even its OG design and also physics put in, and honestly, it looks fantastic. Fascinating enough, the development on the Falcon still continued even after Halo 2 wrapped up, surprising enough with the idea being worked on in Halo 3, but eventually being transformed into a vehicle called the Hornet that we eventually got in the final game. And despite the fact that the vehicle technically in some way did get made, the designer of the OG Falcon from Halo 2, Marcus Lita, was unhappy with the Hornet in Halo 3 and pushed for its inclusion into Halo still, until finally in Halo Reach, it became the UH-144 Falcon that we all know and love. Its role in the game was basically as a Black Hawk sort of role, where basically players would use it to basically fly around the map and transport things. It's basically acting as a basically glorified UNSC smaller version of a Pelican. Its design this time around was more centered around helicopters and overall aesthetic and design, being different from the original Strike Fighter inspired design from Halo 2. Regardless though, it's a classic part of Halo Reach, and honestly I'm glad it made it to the game. And overall, I think it's extremely cool and fascinating that the Falcon was originally in Halo 2. And it's a giant weird journey to basically getting the one that we got in Halo Reach is honestly really crazy to think about. I think that the original design that we see in Halo 2 looks pretty cool, especially with the more resemblance to like a Strike Fighter. Is honestly an interesting deviation, but overall I'm pretty happy with the final version of the Falcon that we got in Halo Reach though. Still though, the weird story of the Falcon from Halo 2 is fascinating and one of those cool little lost tidbits of information. The next vehicle that was cut from Halo 2 that once again took me by surprise was actually the Mongoose. Yep, that famous ATV vehicle that we got from Halo 3. Believe it or not, it was originally supposed to be in Halo 2. But the Mongoose in this version of Halo 2 actually featured a similar but also radically different design than the one we got in Halo 3, and actually had a lot of development work put into it, with it mostly being complete before being cut, with the vehicle being fully built, rendered, and even textures and animations put in as well. Also, the vehicle being fully drivable with particle effects in the environments being testing out. Also, the driving sounds for it were basically the same as the Warthog and were also implemented into the vehicle as well. Also, early ideas for this vehicle included an aiming reticle taken from the Magnum, with the designers testing out the front end weapons for it, basically being able to be used in gameplay. So with a lot of work included, with even screenshots of the Mongoose also appearing in some of the early builds of Halo 2 and also shown in the behind the scenes doc pretty extensively, like here in the audio test environment we see that they're actually using the Mongoose to drive around that map, which is honestly pretty cool. Regardless though, with all this work put into the vehicle, why did it actually get cut? Well, despite the fact that there was already a lot of work put into the Mongoose and making it pretty far along in development, it was ultimately cut from the final game. The reason why was because the designers felt that it interfered too much with the mechanics of the Warthog and the Ghost in the game. Felt like it was mostly going to be unbalanced. And ultimately, that was the version of Halo 2's Mongoose that died. Later on though, as we all know, the Mongoose was eventually brought back in Halo 3 with more of a military and updated design to it, and eventually obviously being a staple of the series soon after. For kind of a fun little bit of lore added on, this version of the Mongoose from Halo 2 was actually canonized as the M270 Mongoose in the Halo universe, basically acting as the pre-Mongoose to the finalized version of Halo 3 that we got, which honestly was a pretty nice reference to this version. Now, did this lost vehicle ever get released by some modders or was discovered in any sort of way? Well, despite the fact that we knew about it for a long time, we weren't actually able to get our hands on it until recently the DigSci team actually released it in one of their cut maps from Halo 2, and honestly, it's pretty fantastic. You know, it has some wonky physics to it. Overall, for my thoughts on Halo 2's version of the Mongoose, I think it's honestly pretty cool. I do like the more sporty ATV design to it, and while it's definitely different to what I'm used to, it's still pretty unique and cool. And from my personal experience trying this thing out in game, it definitely plays as a faster version compared to the one in Halo 3, and honestly I think it's pretty cool that Halo 2 almost had a Mongoose. I think it has a lot of potential, but still I'm ultimately happy that this thing actually made it to the series. The next cut vehicles from Halo 2 were actually the Scorpion variants. This was an early concept from Halo Combat Evolved, but was never fully developed and never made it to the final game. When Halo 2 became active development, the idea was actually reintroduced into Halo 2, with 3D based models being made and some work being done on them, but none of it fully making it into the final game. The first of these cut variants was actually the M808B2 Sun Devil, which was basically an anti-air turret version of the Scorpion tank. It had some early development as the Halo CE Scorpion Scorpion that was used as a base basically, and he designed the variant in the original engine in that game, which then again they would later convert it with updated textures and put it into the Halo 2 engine. But sadly though, this variant of the tank never made it that far, as it was never incorporated, as far as I know, into that engine. The next variant that was cut was actually the Tarantula. It was basically a Scorpion equipped with a missile launcher, which honestly sounds really badass. Like the previous tank version, the developers used the engine from Halo Combat Evolved as a base, and eventually they would put it into Halo 2 later on. And it seemed later though, Bungie would eventually give up on these variants as they never incorporated into the Halo 2 engine or anything like that. Maybe just due to the fact that they weren't interested in the concept or just didn't have enough time to fully implement it in the game. Luckily though, later on the dig site team did recover these lost tank variants and put them in the dig site demo level from Halo Combat Evolved, which is honestly really cool. And I think a lot of these variants have a lot of potential, especially that badass Tarantula one. I mean, come on. The next major UNSC vehicle that cut from the final game was actually the SHIELD ship. This was the large ship found in the Milestone 1 defensive mission, which is one of those several test bed levels in early development that test out all of the new features they were planning for the game. In this specific mission, one of the objectives was the fact that the players would have to clear out troops for this ship to land and basically defend it throughout the level. Some progress was actually put into the SHIELD ship as it did make it fully modeled into the game and was actually concepted by Eddie Smith. Tons of concept art was done for the ship, and possibly at one point, maybe Bungie was considering the fact that the players could have even been able to control the ship. Sadly though, like the unreleased Milestone 1 levels, they actually also got cut from the final game. Luckily though, years later, the dig site team did recover these levels, including the ship as well. Also, a little bit of nice icing on the cake, so to speak, the ship was actually canonized in the Halo universe, first appearing as a non-canon Easter egg in Halo Reach Boot Camp, the graphic novel, then later being canonized as a UNSC Arteris, which was basically a refit heavy whip drop freighter with 4 salvage Covenant energy shield generators put onto it. It's honestly a really nice thing to see that it was put into the Halo universe. And overall, my thoughts on the shield ship from Halo 2, I think it's a really interesting concept that we could have had. And overall, I think the idea of a shield ship in Halo is honestly really cool, and the fact that we could have maybe even piloted such a craft would have been honestly really amazing. It could have opened the door to more interesting flying sections and games, but it's kind of a shame that we never got to see this idea fully realized. Now we have a vehicle called the Strike Fighter, which is basically a cut vehicle from Halo 2. And overall, this was actually a vehicle that really had nothing to do with actual gameplay, but this was merely a cut pure cinematics vehicle, only supposed to be appearing in cutscenes and maybe sections of scripted gameplay in the campaign. The concept for this fighter was thought up around the same time the Falcon was being developed. Early storyboards for Halo 2 showed the Strike Fighter in the Cairo Station level and also the cut Covenant ship level. It would have basically performed a role similar to the Longsword in the final game, where it would basically perform an attack run on the Covenant carrier, bombing it. Later on though, as we all know, Bungie cut the vehicle and basically swapped it with the Longsword in the final game. I'm assuming the reason behind its cancellation was maybe that Bungie was not happy with the Strike Fighter's development and maybe just felt it was easier to put an already developed asset like the Longsword, which was from Halo Combat Evolved, into the game. Still though, a very interesting concept. Later on down the line, the Strike Fighter would live on with the Saber in Halo Reach, basically acting as a similar sort of vehicle that we have in that game. And kind of a weird coincidence, the design of the Strike Fighter also bears a lot of resemblance to the jump ships in Destiny. Who knows, maybe it would have served a similar purpose to that as well. I think overall the Strike Fighter's design in Halo 2 is honestly a really cool and unique vehicle, and while it was only supposed to be a pure cinematics kind of thing, it honestly wouldn't have hurt if it was put into the game. Honestly, it's kind of a shame we never got to see this Halo vehicle in the universe. The next cut vehicle from Halo 2 was actually the Orca, which was mentioned in design docs for Halo 2. Its purpose was basically going to be a troop carrying watercraft. Even other documents show a variant with mortars attached as well. Sadly though, not much is also known about this vehicle, with really no art or models that have been able to be fully recovered by it. It was shown briefly in that behind the scenes doc for Halo 2, but that is really it. I know that Bungie for a long time has toyed with the idea of watercraft in games, and sadly this was just another cut concept that never made it to the final game. Overall, I think it's a shame that we never got to see this, as I honestly would have loved to see more watercraft in Halo, but it is what it is. The next vehicle that we have here might have been a cut vehicle from Halo 2, or just might have been a joke and never been intended to ship in the final build. Either way, it's a hilarious little cut vehicle from the files in the game, basically called the Piglet. It was basically a very scaled down version of the Warthog that had no animations or collision physics required for it to be usable in the game. It was kind of like the toddler's version of the Warthog, kind of like your bike, you usually have training wheels put onto it. And honestly, it's so cute and hilarious. I mean, oh, look at little Master Chief in that little vehicle, just so cute. And luckily we know about this vehicle thanks to the fact in a breakdown by Kenneth Peters in the MCC fighting update on Halo Waypoint forums, he made the vehicle drivable thanks to modding and eventually was released by the dig site team. Overall, I think this thing is absolutely hilarious and I honestly think this kind of thing really should just be in more Halo games in the future. The next cut vehicles, believe it or not, were similar to the Scorpion in Halo 2, in the fact that we were actually originally supposed to be getting Warthog variants in Halo 2, but sadly never made it to the final game. The origin of this idea was actually a concept created by artist Marcus Witt. Images of these cut vehicles were soon shown on the Bungie.net back in the day, really proving the existence of these things during the early development of Halo 2. One of these vehicles was actually the rocket launcher Warthog, but not the one that you're thinking of. This one had a different design than the one we all know, featuring a rocket turret that had vertical barrels instead of horizontal ones that we have in the final games. Players would have been able to use triggers to fire rockets in quick succession with not really too much of a cooldown time. I'm not sure if that's just due to the fact that this was an unreleased vehicle and Bungie was not able to get all the balancing issues right out the way, but still pretty hilarious. This variant actually made it pretty farther compared to some of the other variants. Even some screenshots were posted back in the day from Bungie.net and some of the early versions of the multiplayer, and obviously it did get released by the dig site team as well later on, but as we all know it got cut from the final game, which was a true shame. Other variants of the Warthog were also designed, mainly using Halo CE as the base for the designs, similar to the other Scorpion variants like mentioned earlier. These variants included the Tropic Warthog, the sick-ass Arctic Warthog, and of course the Recovery Warthog, with all these variants having design docs made for them in Halo 2 describing their appearance, with all the other design docs mentioning the fact there was also supposed to be plans for a desert camo Warthog and a night mission camo Warthog, but these never actually made it to any kind of prototyping and were just mentioned in the design docs. And while all of these variants of the Warthog eventually made to some sort of development, obviously making to some kind of prototyping as we obviously have them in the game, eventually though all these variants never made it to the final game as Bungie basically scrapped the whole idea, most likely due to the amount of development time it would have required for all these vehicles, and also just the levels in general, how they would have basically required the use of these things in gameplay. Regardless, so the idea of Warthog variants eventually didn't die in this game, and the idea would eventually make it into other games, like the already mentioned Rocket Warthog from Halo Reach, and also the Recovery Warthog, which also did somewhat appear in some form in Halo 3, which is honestly pretty cool. Overall, I love a lot of these variants, and I kind of wish that they should be in a Halo game. Overall, I love the idea of Warthog variants. It adds a lot of variety to the classic Warthog in Halo, and honestly the fact that Halo 2 was originally supposed to have this is pretty crazy. And honestly, I think that the fact that some of these ideas like the Arctic Warthog or the Tropic Warthog honestly sound fantastic, but they need to be given the right context in the game and the proper level designed around them. Still though, it's a cool concept. Other quick human vehicles that got cut from Halo 2 I wanted to mention included the 2's, a water vehicle that had 2 seats. It had a lot of work put into it with tons of concept art made and even a playable version using Halo CE as a base, and was actually restored thanks to the dig site team. It was also mentioned in the behind the scenes doc for Halo 2, and like we all know it got cut from the game, most likely just due to the sheer amount of work would have to be put in to basically make this thing properly run in the game. Bungie probably just didn't have enough time to get all the water mechanics made, and also the fact that if you're going to include a vehicle like the 2's, you kind of have to make a level just basically using this thing as a concept, and that would require a lot of development time. Still though, overall a pretty cool vehicle. Another cut vehicle from Halo 2 was apparently the Kestrel, which believe it or not was supposed to appear all the way back in Halo 2. The idea for this vehicle was that Bungie wanted to essentially be the human version of the Banshee, but sadly the vehicle was cancelled and scrapped. It was cut mainly due to the fact that the team did not have enough time to basically make the physics around the vehicle work in the engine for the game, which was honestly a true shame. It was also cut from Halo Combat Evolved's development as well. Luckily though, this vehicle is still a really cool idea, and I do kind of wish overall it made it to the game. Well, that was most of the notable UNSC cut vehicles from Halo 2. Now for the next section, we're going to be covering the cut Covenant vehicles, which like UNSC were actually quite a few of them never made it to the final game. Regardless though, let's get into the cut Covenant vehicles, at least more of the notable ones from Halo 2. The first cut Covenant vehicle was actually the anti-air raid, which was originally supposed to be appearing in Halo 2. This vehicle did make it to some prototyping and definitely some work was put into it, as it was developed using Halo CE as a base for it. The idea for this vehicle is it was simply a raid with some plasma AA guns attached to it for anti-air support. And like I said, despite the fact that there was some development put into this vehicle, it looks like the reason why it never made it that far was the fact that number one, it never made into the Halo 2 engine. And also probably just they didn't have enough resources given the time to make Halo 2 to make the vehicle put into the game in a reasonable way. And number two, just not enough resources or time was given to make this vehicle made possible in the game. Luckily though, the concept for this vehicle would never die out, as it will eventually appear later on in Halo 3 as the Patter anti-aircraft rate. It was pretty much just the same version that we could have got in Halo 2, but just with some minor differences. And later on, like many of the cut Halo 2 vehicles that used Halo CE as a base, it was actually made playable thanks to the Dixite team. Overall, I think that's pretty cool that Bungie was originally wanting this vehicle to appear in Halo 2, but honestly I'm not that disappointed as it eventually did make its appearance in Halo 3, so obviously problem solved. The next cut Covenant vehicle that was originally supposed to be in Halo 2, believe it or not, was originally the Chopper. This vehicle is intended to be a major showing off point for the Brutes in Halo 2, showcasing their whole society and how their vehicles would work in the universe. And also the idea and the concept behind it was that Bungie wanted it to be basically a motorcycle for quote tough guys. The idea for this vehicle was actually conceived by Eddie Smith, with the version being made for Halo 2 pretty much looking like the one that we got later on in Halo 3, but with basically the canopy and the back section of the chopper being the only major difference to it. Sadly though, it was cut early on in Halo 2's development as it seemed like it was only concepted and no actual models were actually made and put into the game. Most likely it was cut due to the fact that they just did not have enough resources or time to finish it properly in Halo 2. Luckily though, as we all know, eventually the chopper was resurrected in Halo 3 and soon would become a staple for the Brutes in the franchise. Overall, I'm really happy with the chopper in the final game, and it's really cool that we could have got it in Halo 2. It only would have made this game even better. The next cut Covenant vehicle concept was actually really fascinating, which was the idea of Brute mounts. In early design documents for Halo 2, it mentioned the idea of Brutes mounting animals into battle, an idea that was later conceived for future games unrelated to the Halo franchise, kind of similar to the Locust and Gears of War. Sadly though, beyond some concept art that was made for this idea, it never made it actual any kind of form of mechanics or prototyping in Halo 2, as it looked like it was cut early on, maybe due to the fact they just didn't have enough resources or time to properly put into the game, or maybe that Bungie just wanted to pursue something else. Overall, I think this idea was honestly a real shame that we never got to see it in the game. I think it's a great idea. I think it suits the Brutes perfectly. While I am happy with the choppers in the game, I think that the fact that the Brutes riding animals honestly fits a bit better with their character. It's a true shame that we never got to see it in Halo 2. The next piece of cut Covenant vehicle or cut content for Halo 2 was actually the idea of the large Covenant artillery cannon from Halo 2, but at least in its original version. The reason why it's known as lost media is that in the 2003 demo of Halo 2, it was actually seen in the background firing on the city of New Mombasa, with a huge difference from the Covenant cannon that we got in the final game is the fact that it's enormous, basically shooting at the city before longswords were called in to bomb it. Also, other design documents for other cut levels and maps include lost objectives to destroy this massive cannon at some point in the gameplay as well, but sadly though, this version of the cannon was cut from the final game. Bungie probably just most likely scrapped this as maybe the engine that was used in the final game could not render such a thing on its scale and also be properly used in the final game. Luckily though, the idea of the Covenant artillery cannon did make it to the final game, but just much more of a smaller scale version of it, which was actually called the Type 48 Weevil cannon in the level Outskirts. It's just kind of there and it doesn't really do anything in the game, but if you have some mods you can actually make it playable. Overall, I think the larger version of this cannon wouldn't have hurt anything. I think it's honestly really cool. It kind of acts like a big siege cannon of some sorts. And honestly, I think the idea is really sick and awesome. And the fact that we could have even had objectives to destroy this thing honestly would have added so much cool gameplay moments to the game. Overall, a bit of a shame that we never got to see this larger version of the cannon. The next cut Covenant vehicle actually was mentioned in some early design documents for Halo 2. And this included the idea of a Covenant field truck. Yes, you heard that right. Truckers and grunts in a Covenant field truck. Jesus Christ. The vehicle was mentioned in some early design documents for the game and was briefly thought up, but it was cut early on as basically not really much of anything was done on the vehicle. No concept art or any kind of prototype or model. It was cut early on probably just because of how absurd the idea sounds. But overall, I think the idea is still pretty fascinating and with some development could work. The next cut Covenant vehicle was actually the Command Shuttle, which was basically a cut flying ship from Halo 2. It actually has a lot of really interesting backstory to it. It was designed and fully modeled for the purpose of Halo 2's Milestone 1 levels. In particular, the level Assault. Basically, in that level, the craft would be parked on top of a Forerunner tower where players would have the objective of destroying the ship through a variety of means, including a marine assault, airstrikes, or even using a raid. The level of damage on the ship would determine the alert level of the nearby Covenant forces, overall adding to the cut stealth mechanic of the level. I think in terms of design, I think the overall design of this shuttle is very interesting, with a lot of pieces taking inspiration from the Spirit in Halo CE, with even a new color scheme being different from basically what a lot of the Covenant vehicles look like, with more of a blackish look. Luckily though, this version of the command shuttle was recovered later on by the dig site crew when they actually released the Milestone 1 levels, though in this version you can't actually play it, but it's still pretty cool that's on the map. And eventually in the dig site demo level for Halo CE, it was also put in as well. I'm assuming similar to other cut vehicles from Halo 2, it was used as a base. Its cockpit is actually facing forward like the Spirit, and it is actually fully playable and flyable in that level as well, which is pretty fascinating. Now, this version of the command shuttle was actually not the end of the story, as later on the command shuttle still progressed in development, as Bungie, even though they scrapped this version they made in the Milestone 1 levels, decided to start over completely in design. Eventually, the idea was basically reconceptualized by Eddie Smith and turned into more of a Covenant-like design, similar to other Covenant vehicles. This version of the command shuttle actually appeared in early storyboards for Halo 2, mainly in the mission where the Arbiter and the Elites were dropped off on Threshold to take out the Heretics. It eventually would appear in the epilogue at the end of the mission. After this, some further progress was made as a very primitive model blockout was actually made for it, with the design looking oddly similar to the Lich that we got from 343 in Halo 4. But sadly though, as we all know, this vehicle never made it to the final game and was just mainly replaced by an already developed asset like the Phantoms. For my overall thoughts on this command shuttle, I think that the design is honestly pretty cool. I think that this version of it definitely feels more of a Covenant look and feel to it, and fits more with their overall fleet. And well, that was the interesting cut history of the Lost Covenant shuttle from Halo 2. The next cut Covenant vehicle that we're supposed to get was actually Ghost variants. It was actually mentioned in early design documents for Halo 2 that actually had some really cool and interesting ideas for them. In the documents, they mentioned plans for a ghost called an Excavation Ghost, alongside a VTOL and a Special Forces Ghost variants as well. This concept though looks like it didn't have much development put into it, as it was only mentioned in some design documents, and it was cut from Halo 2 early on. If I had to guess what these ghosts might have looked like, I'm assuming that the Excavation Ghost might have been something like a Heretic Ghost, and maybe the Special Forces Ghost maybe would have been similar to the color scheme of some of the Special Forces guys in the Covenant Empire. Overall though, I think that this idea is really fascinating. I think that honestly it should be revived and put into more detail in a future Halo game. And I guess you can say the idea was sort of revived with skins of the ghosts coming out in future games as well. The next cut Covenant ship that was cut from Halo 2 was actually the Covenant Light Ship, or the Bridge Ship, or the Airbus in some situation. The idea behind this ship, the light ship so to speak, just as the name suggests, was basically to form light bridges for Covenant forces trying to cross a chasm into enemy territory. It would fly into the middle of the chasm, hover then on each side, extend out the light bridges to each side, and then allow the forces to cross over. The early development of this ship included the fact that the idea for the ship was actually conceived by Shin Kang Wang at Bungie, with it debuting first off in the Milestone 1 level Assault, where players would have to cross it to get into the base to attack the command shuttle in that lost Milestone 1 level. In the level, basically, you have to use a lot of stealth, and there was also an alert system that Bungie wanted to add as well. And players would also have to cross this light ship as well. To actually proceed and get into the base in that level, you actually would have had to cross the light ship. And the mechanic of this light ship would have been very fascinating, especially in connection to the stealth system that was also in this level as well. Essentially, most likely, you would have to use stealth to basically cross over the light bridge, depending on the situation. If Covenant forces did detect you at some point, the light bridge would have been deactivated and you would have fell to your death. In terms of design, I do overall like the light ship, with having a more of a sleek Covenant design to it, and also a nice purple finish to it. And despite the fact that there was actually a lot of progress put into this ship with tons of concept art made for it, and even an early blockout model for the ship found in the files for the map, and it eventually being released and kind of finished later on thanks to the dig site team releasing it as part of the Milestone 1 Assault map. Sadly though, as we all know, the ship never made it to the final game. It was cut alongside many other elements from those Milestone 1 levels, which were mainly meant for prototyping and testing out elements for the final game. Regardless though, the idea for this ship never made it past those levels. Still though, there is sort of a happy ending to this, as it was sort of canonized in the Halo universe, mainly in the book Halo Oblivion as the CPV in that story. Overall, that was the cut light ship from Halo 2. I think it's honestly a pretty cool ship, and I wish it would have made playable and made it to the final game, as there's a lot of purposes it could have served in the campaign and story. Overall, though, it's kind of a shame we never got to see it. Another sort of cut vehicle that was cut from Halo 2 on the Covenant side of things was actually the variants of the Shadow. Now, the Shadow did make it to the final version of the game, but did you know there was actually supposed to be tons of variants for it? The vehicle in the main game shows up only in the level outskirts. We're basically carrying ghosts inside the vehicle, but there was actually a lost cut version of it that actually had the ability to carry troops into battle. This variant of the Shadow is basically the same as it is in the final game, but the only difference is that in the middle there's a sort of hovering line of seats where the troops would sit on, with even some animations for the Covenant using it as well, but a lot of it not finished. This variant of the Shadow is actually found in the Halo 2 shared map files by modders in the MCC. It was also shown in the Halo 2 manual as well for the game. And also in the Halo 2 Anniversary, weirdly, it also made it to the files in that game as well, fully rendered, which is honestly pretty fascinating. And this variant of the Shadow actually did get released by the dig site team, fully playable in the game, despite the fact that some of the animations for the City Now Covenant characters in the seat not finished. Other variants of this vehicle were also supposed to be in the game. Early design documents also mentioned the idea of an excavation Shadow, but it looks like not much work was put into it. This was most likely just a heretic version of that vehicle. Overall, for my thoughts on these Shadow variants, I think overall they make a lot of sense. I think it's logical to have a troop transporting Shadows. I think it would have given more character to the vehicle, and it's already just mostly complete. I mean, why not put it in the anniversary version of Halo 2 anyway? Luckily though, thanks to modders, we did get to see what this version would have looked like in the Halo 2 game, so that's pretty cool. The next cut Covenant ship that we have here is kind of similar to the previous one, which was actually a variant type. This time around though for the Phantom in Halo 2, but this time around this variant would include door gunners added to the side of it. It's kind of a small detail, but actually this version of the Phantom didn't even appear into Halo 3. It was originally supposed to be appearing in Halo 2. Actually, a fully workable version of this variant was made for the E3 2003 demo for Halo 2, and in many early storyboards also showcase this variant as well, but ultimately it was never put into the final game, most likely due to the fact that the game was so rushed in terms of its development and also time constraints. Luckily though, later on, the dig site team did recover this variant of the Phantom and did release it back into the game. Overall, for my thoughts on this variant of the Phantom, even though it's a pretty small and minuscule detail so to speak, it's honestly kind of amazing that we could have got this version of Halo 2, and I'm still really happy that it made it to other games like in Halo 3 and basically became commonplace after. Still though, it's fascinating that this version of the Phantom we could have saw in Halo 2. Whew, overall that was some of the major cut vehicles and ships from Halo 2, a pretty huge amount ranging from original vehicles to even variants. Still though, it was a huge amount of cut content that we never got to see in the final game. And even though we've already covered so many cut vehicles from Halo 2, I'm sure in the future modders and some other people in the community will be able to find out more and discover even more lost content. Overall though, that was all of the major cut vehicles and ships from Halo 2. Still really cool and fascinating. Now let's get into all of the major cut weapons from Halo 2. Some of them are actually really fascinating and also surprised me, and could have changed the gameplay in a lot of ways, or even Halo history. Regardless though, let's get into the cut weapons, starting out first with the human weapons. First off, the first human weapon that we'll discuss here that was cut from Halo 2 was actually the flamethrower, a weapon that was mysteriously absent from the final game. Reason now is that it was actually just cut from the final game. The flamethrower in the first Halo was honestly very difficult to model and build according to Bungie, and while the flamethrower never actually made it to the Xbox version, it would eventually make it to the Halo Combat Evolved version on the PC. So going into the second game, they wanted to redesign it and make it better, and also make it more available for everybody. Like many of Halo 2's elements, the flamethrower was completely redesigned, featuring the iconic shark-like face and the panels on the front. And Bungie actually did make it pretty far along in development for this weapon as well, having it modeled, rendered, and gameplay shooting out fire as well. It was shown in the behind-the-scenes doc for Halo 2, and also a few release screenshots as well. Sadly though, as we all know, it was cut from the final game. The most likely reason for its cancellation was most likely just because they could not fix all the issues that naturally came with the flamethrower. Issues like the fact that a lot of the physics surrounding the flamethrower would have been difficult to properly implement in Halo 2's engine. Also the fact too, just you have a lot of balancing issues when it comes to the flamethrower. This was especially an issue with the original Halo Combat Evolved flamethrower. Still though, at the end of the day, the flamethrower was ultimately scrapped. Now the legacy of this flamethrower was not forgotten, as Bungie would eventually release the flamethrower in Halo 3, with the design of it in Halo 3 pretty much being the same one as it was designed in Halo 2. And as far as I can see in some of the gameplay for Halo 2's flamethrower, it pretty much plays the same as the Halo 3's flamethrower. And later on, the Dig Site team did release Halo 2's flamethrower in-game, but it was not really usable and needed to be fixed really thanks to modding. Overall though, that was the interesting story of Halo 2's flamethrower. I think it's very fascinating that it was originally supposed to be in Halo 2, but overall I'm kind of indifferent to it as Halo 3's flamethrower is kind of whatever to me, and this looks like it was pretty much going to be the same version. Still though, it's a fascinating piece of lost content. The next cut human weapon in Halo 2 were actually flashbang grenades. It was mentioned in early design documents for Halo 2 with its purpose of stunning enemies, but obviously not dealing the same damage as frag grenades. Eventually though, it seemed like that these flashbang grenades did not make it past the early development stage, mostly got cut due to the resources not being available, and also maybe just due to the fact that that cut stealth system was also cut out of the final game, which obviously these grenades would have contributed to. Still though, I think that the flashbang grenades in Halo 2 were a really interesting idea. The next cut human weapon in Halo 2 was actually the general purpose machine gun, or the GPMG, or just that machine gun that you have in Halo 2. Now, it was pretty fascinating when you played Halo 2's campaign, as this machine gun was basically the only fixed turn in the game for the player to use, but you can never attach it or use it or carry it with you. But did you know originally in Halo 2, that was actually supposed to be the case? Yep, you would be able to rip it off its turn and use it as a first-person weapon in the final game. And overall, this version of the machine gun was actually found thanks to modders, and it's actually pretty complete, even with firing, reload animations being put into it as well, with even an alternate model of the machine gun with no buttstock and removable magazines was made as well. It was actually discovered in the files of the final build of Halo 2 with some strings of codes referencing to the machine gun being able to be picked up and used. Eventually though, in Halo 2 on the MCC on the PC version, the machine gun was added to the game's shared directory, allowing it to be spawned and being used in the game via modding. So with this weapon pretty much being mostly complete and was found in the files of the game, why was it actually cut? Well, no reason has been given for sure, but it was most likely cut just due to the fact that they probably just didn't have enough time to make it fully work in the game with the physics and also the balancing issues that would have came alongside this thing in the gameplay. Now, like mentioned, this machine gun was found thanks to modding, and it's actually been playable for quite a while thanks to mods, but also you can play it in the Halo 2 Uncut mod by Vengeful Van Damme, which honestly I highly recommend. Overall, I love this version of the machine gun that we could have gotten in Halo 2, with it in moments being a little broken, sure, and unbalanced, but honestly just truly amazing at the same time. Obviously though, later on we all know that this idea of the machine gun being used in Halo games was later repurposed in Halo 3, but this time around in third person where you pick up the gun, which is still a pretty cool idea. The next cut human weapon that was cut from Halo 2 was actually a variant of the GP machine gun in Halo 2, but of course having a grenade launcher attached to it. It would have been able to shoot 20 to 25mm grenades at enemies. It seemed like progress on this weapon actually made it pretty far in the development, as a full-on model was developed for the game, and honestly it looks pretty cool. With major differences of this model compared to the version like the machine gun that we got in the final game is one, we have a huge magazine underneath the machine gun, probably carrying all the grenades, with the belts of machine ammo feeding into the side of it. Now for some backstory of this weapon. Bungie actually was pretty interested in this variant of the machine gun. It actually showed up at some early concept art for Halo 2, and eventually Bungie decided to develop it further with having a fully rendered model in the game with animations. Sadly though, as the first person variant of the machine gun was cut as well, this grenade variant was also cut, most likely just due to balancing issues and not having enough time to fix all the issues and kink. Later on though, the Dig Site team would recover this variant and become available thanks to modding in the game, which overall I think this variant is really cool, and I think it's a kind of neat variation on the machine gun. The next cut human weapon that was cut from the game was actually the silenced SMG, which honestly was pretty surprising to me that this was originally supposed to appear all the way back in Halo 2. The model for this weapon was basically a standard SMG from Halo 2, but with a silencer put on the barrel, even having a unique sound and particle effects completed with it as well. Sadly though, in the rush to complete the game, it seems like that this weapon was cut, most likely due to the fact that the whole cut stealth mechanic of Halo 2 was already scrapped, so in effect this weapon got scrapped as well. Luckily though, this weapon wouldn't stay dead forever, as later on in the Windows Vista release of Halo 2, the weapon was actually put into the game, specifically on the map example. And from what I can see of the Vista's version of the silenced SMG, the gameplay of it looks pretty cool and solid. Eventually though, as we all know, the weapon was brought back in force for Halo 3 ODST, where the weapon debuted alongside the many new stealth elements in that game, where honestly the silenced SMG worked the best in that environment. And later on in the release of Halo 2 on PC for the MCC, the weapon was actually added thanks to modding, and honestly it's really cool that it got restored. And overall, that was the silenced SMG that we could have got from Halo 2. I think it's really fascinating that we could have got this version in Halo 2, and even though, like I said, we did kind of get it with Halo 2 Vista in a sort of way, I think it's really fascinating we could have had all these stealth weapons and a whole stealth system that we just never got to see in the original Halo 2 game. Still though, it's pretty fascinating. The next cut weapon we have here is actually the EMP Mine. It was actually a briefly discussed weapon mentioned in the Halo 2 design docs for the game in very early development. Basically, the mine would have caused a reaction causing all electronics to die, similar to what an EMP usually does in movies and entertainment. This idea was actually never pursued that much in development though. It's probably just a huge amount of gameplay mechanics that would have been required to actually make this thing work. Just could not have been possible. Just the development time alone caused this thing just to be scrapped from the final game. Still, the fact that an EMP mine was considered for Halo 2 is pretty crazy. It's pretty fascinating. The next cut weapon from Halo 2 that was human related was actually the gravity rifle. This was a weapon cut early on in Halo 2's development. The rifle was actually a cut Halo Combat Evolved weapon that made it pretty far in development before being cut. It was mentioned in the early design documents for Halo 2 before it was also cut early on. Not much to be said about this one. The next cut weapon from Halo 2 was actually a really early concept of explosive charges and mines, which were actually considered for Halo 2 early on in development. Satchel charges, explosives, and mines were mentioned in the early design documents for Halo 2, but sadly as it seems it was cut early on by Bungie. And even though no specific reason was given for its cancellation, I most likely speculate that the resources needed to make this mechanic work in the game, which probably would have included tons of destructible environments and physics that would have needed to be added to the final game, would just kind of made it impossible to be added, especially given the hardware limitations on the Xbox and the Bungie's already stretched out resources in making the game. Weirdly, later on, the satchel charges and explosives would have small cameos in the Halo universe. Obviously first in the art piece by Warren McGlee's, where Chief is surrounded by tons of weapons that he would use in the games, including the satchel charges, as well as hinting at their existence as well and confirming it. Overall though, I think the idea of Halo having explosives in the gameplay, it really could have shooken things up and honestly would have been amazing, but just I can totally see why it was cut from Halo 2, just simply all the resources that would have required it to make it possible in game. Still though, overall, explosives in Halo would have been lit. Now that we've actually covered most of the human weapons that were cut from Halo 2, now let's get into the major cut Covenant weapons from Halo 2. So let's get into it. The first cut weapon from the Covenant for Halo 2 that we'll discuss is actually called the Brute Grenade. They were grenades that were intended to be used by brutes in battle. Some development on these weapons were done with design docs being drawn up, with the overall design being influenced majorly by incendiary grenades in the Halo universe. It included spikes near the top of the grenade and also would have stuck on enemies and possibly exploded or also been on fire as a result. Either way though, a lot of development was put into it with even a 3D model built into the game, but later on though they were cut from the final release. Possibly the reason for this was with the team at Bungie not being able to fully finalize it before the final release of the game. And despite these grenades never making it to the final game, these grenades would in spirit appear in a different form so to speak with the spike grenades in Halo 3 that we have today, which are honestly pretty cool and honestly would have just probably served the same purpose as the brute grenades. And even later on, the DigSci team would actually release the Brute Grenade officially in one of their mods later on, finally giving access to people who wanted to experience the lost Brute Grenade from Halo 2. Overall, I think the design is pretty cool, and even though this is basically just an early version of the Spike Grenade, at least in Halo 2, I honestly think it's a pretty cool idea and wish it made it into the Halo 2 game. The next cut Covenant weapon that we have here is actually called the Blam Might Harpoon, which funny enough was actually a cut weapon from Halo Combat Evolved. But it seemed as the development of Halo 2 progressed, the idea of bringing it back possibly as a Covenant weapon started to appear, with even Blamites as the harpoons on the weapon. Quick side note, Blamites are actually those pink crystals for the needlers you see in Halo, just if you didn't know. This cut weapon was actually mentioned in Halo 2 design docs briefly, with even the multiplayer lead Max Hermelman professing his love for the old cut Halo Combat Evolved weapon and probably wanted to bring it into Halo 2. Sadly though, not much development was actually put into this weapon, as no models were able to be made for it, and pretty much it was being cut early on in development. Overall, I like this cut weapon and this variation of the harpoon. I liked it back when it was a cut weapon for Halo Combat Evolved, and I kind of wish it made it into Halo 2. Regardless, still pretty interesting. So we have this pretty insane Covenant version of the flamethrower that was cut from Halo 2. This weapon was called the Disintegrator, which honestly, just from the name alone, sounds amazing. It was featured in the beta build of Halo 2 and eventually was released later on by the DigSci team thanks to modding. The current model of it though, as it's released in its standard state, is actually untextured and could spew fire in the game though, which is honestly pretty cool. Interesting though, from a third-person perspective, it looks like it can also spew out red fire plasma of some sorts, which is honestly pretty cool. The weapon also would have had a reticle attached to it with some unfinished cooldown bar below it as well for some of the mechanics of the weapon. Even in the Halo 2 Vista release, modders found in the code some sound effects for the weapon as well, just just to show that a lot of development was actually put into this weapon. But sadly, despite all the development and work that was put into this weapon, despite all the progress that was made, it was ultimately unfinished and cut from the final game. Bungie most likely did this due to all the time constraints just in the process of making that game, which is honestly a true shame as I really love this weapon. I mean, I think the idea of having a Covenant flamethrower, or sort of equivalent to the human flamethrower, is honestly amazing and would have been a great mechanic added to the whole Halo sandbox. And also just would have added more character to the brutes and given more lore to their side and the faction as a whole. Honestly, regardless, the Disintegrator is amazing and hopefully one day it makes its final release in a Halo game. The next weapon we have here is actually a weapon called the Plasma Mortar. This was actually an early cut Covenant weapon based on a knee mortar from World War II, and mainly a continuation of the gravity winch from Halo Combat Evolved, which was also a cut weapon in that game as well. It seemed like in the development of Halo 2, many cut ideas from Halo Combat Evolved were reintroduced into Halo 2's development, including that cut weapon, the gravity winch. But this time around for Halo 2, it was actually turned into a Covenant weapon with plasma used as the projectile. Some development was put into this with a rough 3D model made for it, but no textures or solidified surfaces were put onto it, and past this, nothing else came from the weapon as it seemed like it was cut early on in development. Overall, I think this weapon would have been nice, and I think it's a shame that we never got to see it in Halo 2. I mean, the idea of having a classic style mortar in a Halo game just sounds sick. The next Covenant weapon we have here, believe it or not, and to my surprise as well, was actually the plasma turret. Similar to the machine gun from the human side, you're actually supposed to take off the plasma turret from its stands and use it as a complete first-person weapon. This cut weapon even had a first-person model attached to it with animations for firing included as well. Also, I wanted to mention that the fast rate of fire with the plasma is also pretty insane, as there's really no cooldown time, and I could definitely see how unbalanced this thing would have been. Overall, despite the fact that there was a lot of work put into it seemed like Bungie just never intended to be put into the final game, most likely just due to balancing issues, or maybe just due to time constraints. Overall, I think that the plasma turret was a really cool cut weapon from Halo 2 that I honestly wish made it to the final game. Even though it's completely unbalanced, I think it's really fun to play. Luckily though, in mods like Halo 2 Uncut, and thanks also to the Dixie team and great modders like the Vengeful Van Damme, it was added back into the game somewhat, so honestly you have your chance to play it. Overall, this was a sick weapon we never got to see. One of the major weapons that were cut from Halo 2's development was actually the usable Jackal energy sword. Yep, I know it's crazy. It actually made it pretty far in development with even having a workable version usable by modders in the game. How this lost weapon would have actually functioned in the game is in most situations you would have grabbed the energy sword and it would have been held in the left hand, and in the right hand you would have held a small secondary weapon for defense like a plasma pistol or a magnum. And basically in gameplay the shield would have essentially acted like a riot shield from Call of Duty, providing some much needed cover from enemies and from those goddamn cursed Jackal snipers. In most gameplay scenarios, how you've been able to get the shield most likely would have been if you killed a Jackal, you would have been able to collect it from them, or if you killed one of those flood carrier forms that was carrying it, which would also cut enemies from Halo 2, you'll have been able to collect them as well during the gameplay. For the weapon's origin, early ideas were conceived by animator John Bookness, if I said that name correctly, around the early 2003 period of Halo 2's development in these pages of sketches, basically showing early ideas of what the shield been able to do. This included the idea of it being able to collect energy from weapons being fired at it and basically shoot it back at its attackers. Also, alternate animations for the shield were thought of as well, and the idea of the Jackal shield being able to form some kind of drop shield around the player was also thought of as well, kind of similar to the drop shield ability that we eventually got in Halo Reach. Now, most of these were just proposed things for the Jackal energy shield and still were just very early ideas and never made into serious development, but still overall these ideas are just truly insane and honestly incredible. I love these ideas. Later on, development for this cut weapon seemed like it was progressing pretty well, as even though we never got most of those early ideas, the Jackal shield was actually made into a workable model and animations were done for it. But ultimately though, sadly, it never made it to the final build of Halo 2. It seemed like the most reason why behind its cancellation was just most likely due to balancing issues, and maybe just also due to time constraints for Halo 2's development, causing the cancellation of this lost weapon. Luckily though, like mentioned, thanks to modders, it's actually now playable in the game thanks to mods like Halo 2 Uncut and thanks to awesome modders in the community. And overall, I love the idea of the Jackal energy shield being an actual usable weapon in gameplay. Honestly sounds like a great idea. I think it's kind of a common giveaway for it just being so, but honestly it was a true shame that this never made it to the final game, especially with those proposed ideas and abilities from early ideas of this weapon. Just sound truly insane and honestly would have been amazing for Halo 2. Still though, overall it's a pretty fascinating cut weapon. Well, that was all all the major cut weapons that I wanted to mention from Halo 2. Now let's get into the other faction, which is the Forerunners, and all of their lost weapons for Halo 2. Now, there's not as many weapons when it comes to the Forerunners, but I still wanted to mention them. The first of these was actually the Sentinel Needler. This was actually a cut Forerunner weapon from Halo 2 that was basically the Sentinel beam, but it would be able to shoot out red needles, similar to the projectile shot out by the Enforcers, and also the Needlers in Halo 2. The weapon, believe it or not, was built and thanks to modders was actually realized in the final game, but it was ultimately cut from the final build of Halo 2, as variants of Sentinel Beam and that whole concept was basically cut from the overall game. In the files of Halo 2 Vista, modders are actually able to find the crosshair and weapon pickup icons for it as well, so it seemed like the idea did make it pretty far along in development at some point. But Bungie scrapped the whole variation system, probably just not to confuse the player overall. The next variant that got cut from the final game was actually the weapon called Sentinel Beam Grenade Launcher, and the files of Halo 2 Vista even had its own crosshair and weapon pickup icons as well. The final cut variant from the game was actually a weapon called the Sentinel Enforcer Charged Bolt, which unlike the other variants, there's really not much as known about this weapon. There were crosshair and weapon pickup icons, but they were only assumed and not actually confirmed to be leaked in the files. And to be honest with you, there's just not much known about the weapon for sure, as it's not really for sure why it was cut or why it was actually put in there. Luckily though, all of these variants of the Sentinel Beam are actually available thanks to modders and some mods for the game, and honestly, I think the overall variant system for the Sentinel Beam, despite some of the kooky ones like the grenade launcher, overall sounds like a really great idea, and it's kind of a shame that we never got to see it in future Halo games. It's kind of cool it was considered a cut and a lost element for Halo 2. Now for this section of the weapons video, I want to mention some smaller random bits of cut weapons that really don't have much context being here, but I still wanted to mention. The first of these is called the Shredder. We also have another one called the Sniper Rod, and finally we even have the pike that some of the Honor Guard used in the final game, usable now thanks to mods. And at some point, all these weapons were actually mentioned in the early design docs for Halo 2 and some early ideas, but sadly just not much was made in terms of development or even in terms of details about these weapons, besides the actual pikes, which did make it to the game but only with the brutes. Another smaller cut feature was actually the original version of the BR rifle in Halo 2, which in the final game was basically a 3-round burst rifle, but in the original game, especially in that E3 demo from 2003, it was actually just a single shot weapon, but it was really changed further on in development, most likely due to balancing issues. So though, I think that the original weapon is honestly pretty cool, and it was released by the Digside team, so if you want to give it a try, go ahead. Whew, and overall, that was all the major cut weapons that were cut from Halo 2. A lot of them are honestly really cool and should have been in the final game, while some of them were just quite unnecessary. I'm sure I missed a lot of cut weapons that were never made it to the final game, but I just wanted to mention all the ones that I was able to discover and all the major ones I felt worth mentioning. Overall, this was a really fascinating deep dive into some lost weapons from the final version of Halo 2. So that was all the major cut content from Halo 2 that I wanted to mention. With a huge amount of it, and even with me just covering so much material, I'm sure there's plenty of things that I might have missed, as Halo 2 was just so ambitious in scope, and arguably had even more cut content that we're even discovering to this day, especially compared to other games in the franchise. And I really found a lot of enjoyment just looking at this lost content for Halo 2. A lot of new information that really surprised me, and honestly just shows what kind of game Halo 2 could have been. Overall though, if you liked the video of me covering all of the major cut content from Halo 2 and you want to see more, just please subscribe, comment, any kind of support really does help, and hopefully y'all have a good day. Peace, and always remember with Halo 2, finish the fight.